There's a particular quality to the voice of someone who's finally admitting defeat, not in words, but in inflection. Listen closely to Scott Bessent these days, and you'll hear it underneath every carefully measured phrase. The Treasury Secretary of the world's largest economy sounds like a man who's just realized the game has changed, and he's no longer holding the stronger cards. For decades, the relationship between Washington and Beijing operated on a familiar script. The United States set terms. China sometimes resisted, sometimes negotiated, but the fundamental hierarchy remained unquestioned. American markets mattered. American technology mattered. American military power mattered. The balance of leverage, however complicated, tilted westward. But something has shifted. Not overnight. Not in the dramatic way conflicts usually announce themselves. Instead, it happened quietly, across supply chains and manufacturing floors, in boardrooms and military procurement offices. By the time most people noticed, the repositioning was already complete. China wasn't asking for a seat at the table anymore. They were redesigning the table itself. The Wall Street Journal's reporting this week crystallized what analysts have been quietly worrying about for months. Beijing has announced plans to restrict shipments of rare earth magnets, materials absolutely critical to American military operations, to any corporation that maintains ties to the Pentagon. Meanwhile, the same materials flow freely, accelerated even, to civilian firms with no defense contracts. The message is unmistakable. We decide now who gets access and who doesn't. This isn't trade negotiation. This is leverage deployed with surgical precision. This is Beijing reminding Washington that in the modern economy, control over resources equals control over outcomes. Part 2. The framework that isn't. Let's be clear about what happened, and more importantly, what didn't. Bessent announced that Washington and Beijing had reached a framework. That word matters because it tells you everything about how fragile this moment actually is. Not an agreement, not a treaty, not even a formal trade deal, a framework. It's the diplomatic equivalent of a handshake that both parties can walk away from whenever circumstances change. Here's what the framework supposedly contains. China agrees to delay implementing its new rare earth licensing restrictions for 12 months. In exchange, Washington steps back from its threatened 100% tariff on Chinese goods. On paper, this looks like a reasonable trade-off. Each side gives something, each side gets something. Classic negotiation. Except Bessent's body language tells a completely different story. When he discussed the arrangement in press conferences, there was no celebration. There was no declaration of victory. Instead, you hear something closer to apprehension. He's essentially saying, we have an understanding, not a guarantee, not a promise, an understanding. Something that exists primarily in conversation and in the court of public opinion, not in binding legal language. And here's why that matters. China controls the world's largest reserves of rare earth elements. They dominate production of the refined magnets that military systems depend on. They manufacture components that power guided missiles, fighter jet engines, advanced radar systems, and satellite infrastructure. They're not minor players in some niche market. They're choke points, they're gatekeepers. And they know it. When you have that kind of leverage, a framework is more useful to you than a binding treaty because you can interpret it loosely. You can fulfill the letter of the agreement while subverting its spirit. You can make technically compliant decisions that still accomplish your strategic objectives. The weaker party, in this case, the United States, gets locked into public commitments that Beijing can slowly erode without ever formally breaking the deal. Bessent understands this, which is precisely why he doesn't sound confident. He sounds like someone trying to keep a dam from breaking by appealing to the better nature of the water. It's not a strategy. It's hope, dressed up in diplomatic language. Part 3. The minerals beneath our feet. Before we go further, you need to understand what rare earth elements actually means to the functioning of the American military and economy. It's not some arcane technical detail. It's the fundamental substrate upon which modern power rests. Rare earths, a category that includes 17 specific elements with names like neodymium, dysprosium, and terbium, are the active ingredients in permanent magnets. These magnets appear in fighter jets. They appear in missile guidance systems. They appear in the drone technology that projects American military presence across the globe. They're not optional components. They're core infrastructure, but they're also everywhere else. Every smartphone contains rare earth elements. The electric vehicles that governments worldwide are rushing to manufacture and deploy, they need rare earth magnets for their electric motors. Advanced computer chips require these materials in their production. Wind turbines, the clean energy infrastructure that nations are building to reduce carbon emissions, relies heavily on permanent magnets made from rare earth materials. In other words, China's control over rare earth production and processing isn't just about military leverage, though. It absolutely is that. It's also about economic leverage. It's about the future energy economy, the future transportation system, the future telecommunications infrastructure. It's about gatekeeper control over the 21st century's most essential resources. China understands this completely. They've spent decades building dominant position in rare earth extraction and processing, turning it from a mining operation into an integrated industry, where they control every step from raw ore to finished magnet. No other country has built competing capacity at scale. When China moves, there are no alternatives. There's just scarcity and delay. Part 4. The Soybean Strategy. Now let's look at something that seems less dramatic but may ultimately matter more. Soybeans. China has built enormous stockpiles of soybeans. Analysts estimate that by the end of 2025, Beijing will control roughly 36% of the world's total soybean reserves. That's not accidental. That's strategic planning. When you control a third of global supply, you're not subject to market pressures. You can wait, you can delay, you can use your inventory as leverage. And that's exactly what appears to be happening. The United States officially claims that China has committed to purchasing 12 million tons of soybeans by January and 25 million tons annually for the next 3 years. But analysts at firms like S&P Global are, pretty skeptical. They project that actual Chinese purchases will likely come much later, probably January or February, and will likely reach only 8.5 million tons for the 2025 to 2026 season. Notice what that creates: uncertainty and timing pressure. If China waits until January to place orders, many American farmers may have already faced financial pressure so severe that they've made different decisions about their operations. They may have sold land. They may have restructured debt. They may have shifted to different crops. By the time Beijing's orders arrive, the damage to the American agricultural economy has already been absorbed. This is economic pressure without the appearance of aggression. This is leverage that looks like market forces. And it's honestly devastating for the farming communities that American politicians always invoke, but rarely protect. Part 5. The supply chain crisis nobody's talking about. While all this high-level political negotiation was happening, something else was occurring at the ports and in the containers crossing the Pacific. This is happening right before the holiday season, the period when American retailers stock shelves with toys, electronics, seasonal decorations, and all the low-cost consumer goods that Chinese factories produce. The timing couldn't be worse. Retailers tried to prepare. Some did front-load inventory earlier in the year, attempting to beat the tariff deadlines and lock in lower costs. But that buffer is thinning now. Supply chain surveys show that less than half of American retailers have fully restarted their holiday season orders. Many are still hesitating. The reasons are obvious: rising freight costs, uncertainty about future tariff levels, and the real possibility that tariff levels could spike again before the season ends. What happens when inventory runs low? Prices rise, selection shrinks, and consumers feel it directly in their wallets. Walmart has already warned investors that it will be raising prices on non-food imported goods. That includes toys, clothing, and household items. Meanwhile, the cheap online imports that Americans have grown accustomed to, products available from Chinese e-commerce platforms like Temu or Shein, now face tariffs that cut directly into the price advantage that made those platforms attractive in the first place. Online sellers have to either absorb the tariff costs themselves, cutting into already thin margins, or pass them to consumers. Small businesses are particularly vulnerable. Consider an American home goods retailer that sources most of its Christmas decorations from Chinese suppliers. Their containers are stuck in China, awaiting customs clearance. The customs bills alone could exceed $1 million. That cost doesn't disappear. It gets passed directly to consumers buying artificial Christmas trees and holiday decorations. The irony is sharp. The holiday season, meant to be a time of abundance and celebration for American consumers, may instead bring empty shelves, limited selection, and higher prices. The economic pressure is both visible and intimate. It's felt at checkout counters and in the stress of trying to find gifts for children and family members. And this is just what we can see right now. The real danger lies ahead. Part 6. The Hidden Hand. What makes this situation genuinely precarious is that the apparent calm could reverse instantly. Bessent keeps repeating the same warning, dressed in different words. If China doesn't follow through, if Beijing decides the framework no longer serves its interests, if the political calculus in Beijing shifts, everything could unravel. Consider the mechanics. If China tightens its rare earth licensing restrictions in January, which would technically violate the framework but in ways that are difficult to prove or remediate, the impact on American military contractors and tech companies would be immediate and severe. Suppliers would begin running low on critical materials, production schedules would be disrupted, military procurement timelines would slip. The impact cascades outward from there. Or, alternatively, if Beijing simply continues to delay soybean purchases until American farmers have already suffered significant losses, the damage to rural communities will be real, even if the technical terms of the agreement are nominally being met. You can fulfill the letter of an agreement while still accomplishing your strategic objectives. That's the subtle skill of leverage-based negotiation. This is where we need to step back and ask what this situation actually represents. Is this a sustainable new relationship between the world's two largest economies? Is this a temporary truce before the next round of escalation? Or is it something else entirely? A recognition that the old rules have changed and that economic interdependence can be weaponized in ways that military power sometimes cannot. Bessent seems to be signaling something important in his careful language. The United States can no longer assume that the institutions and agreements that have governed international trade for the past several decades will function as designed. The old playbook doesn't work when one party is willing to weaponize the supply chains that keep both economies running. Part 7. The Structural Reality. This isn't a recent development. This is the culmination of decades of decisions that prioritized short-term cost efficiency over long-term strategic autonomy. American companies could buy rare earth magnets cheaper from China than they could manufacture them domestically. So they did. Markets worked as intended. Capital flowed to the lowest cost producer. But capital markets don't have a national security settings. They don't factor in the cost of vulnerability. Now, Bessent is essentially arguing that this needs to change. He's pushing for direct American investment in rare earth mining and processing. He's advocating for the development of domestic supply chains that don't run through Beijing. He's trying to say, in language both urgent and, well, urgent, that the United States needs to rebuild productive capacity in areas critical to national survival, even if that means accepting higher costs in the short term. This is an unspoken admission that the neoliberal model, the idea that open global trade and complete international supply chain integration always serves everyone's interests, has limits. It serves everyone's interests right up until it doesn't, at which point you discover that you've optimized yourself into a position of vulnerability. Part 8. What the agreement actually is. This framework is a political understanding. It's what both sides are saying publicly they've agreed to, but it lacks the legal infrastructure to force compliance. If China doesn't place soybean orders at the promised volume, what exactly happens? The United States can lodge a formal complaint. Diplomatic conversations can intensify. The deal can be publicly characterized as having failed, but there's no automatic penalty. There's no mechanism to compel Beijing to act. And critically, China hasn't even formally acknowledged the specific numbers that the United States is publicly citing. Beijing has agreed to the general concept of purchasing American agricultural products, but there's meaningful daylight between a general concept and a specific contractual obligation measured in millions of tons. This is where analysts begin to express quiet skepticism. There's no documented evidence that China has actually placed orders near the scale that American officials are claiming. There's a difference between what's been announced and what's been contracted. What's announced can be walked back. What's been contracted is harder to reverse. The tariff relief that accompanies the soybean commitment tells a similar story. Yes, Beijing suspended some of the retaliatory duties it had imposed on American agricultural goods. But soybeans still face a 13% tariff, which keeps them substantially less attractive than South American alternatives from an economic perspective. So even with tariff relief, Chinese buyers can still rationally prefer Brazilian or Argentinian supply. The tariff relief is real but insufficient to actually drive purchasing decisions toward American product. What's happening here is that the agreement creates the appearance of a reset while preserving most of the underlying structural advantages that favor China. It buys time. It reduces immediate escalation pressure. But it doesn't actually solve the fundamental problem. American agriculture and American defense manufacturing are now more dependent on Chinese decisions than they were before. Part 9. The Geometry of Vulnerability. Let's think about what the last few months have revealed about the structure of vulnerability in a globally integrated economy. But what happens when the dependence is asymmetrical? What happens when country A depends heavily on country B for critical materials, while country B has alternatives? The theory of mutually beneficial trade, well, it breaks down. The more dependent party becomes vulnerable to pressure from the less dependent party. That's the situation the United States faces with China on rare earth materials. And that's the situation American farmers face with Chinese demand for their product. The asymmetry creates leverage that can be deployed. And leverage, once you have it, is very difficult not to use. China has been methodical about building this position. They've invested in control of supply chains. They've built processing infrastructure. They've accumulated strategic reserves. And they've done it while American policymakers were focused on other things. Not because Americans were stupid, but because optimizing supply chains for efficiency and cost looks exactly the same as optimizing them for vulnerability until the moment when someone demonstrates that these interests can diverge. Bessent's warnings are essentially a belated recognition of this reality. The United States can't go backward. It can't unglobalize supply chains that are now fundamentally integrated. It can't compel companies to pay more for materials when cheaper alternatives exist. What it can do is begin, laboriously and expensively, to build redundancy and independence in areas where it's truly critical. But building that independence takes years. It requires investment. It requires convincing American companies to accept higher costs. It requires government support and protection that sits uneasily with free market ideologies. And most crucially, it requires doing all of this while managing an adversarial relationship with China. Part 10. The Clock and the Calendar. Bessent has been very specific about timing. Think about what that timing means. American retailers need to finalize their holiday inventory right now. They need to commit to how many products they're ordering, locking in costs and shipping schedules. But there's still profound uncertainty about what tariff rates will actually be in place. There's still skepticism about whether Chinese suppliers will actually be able to fulfill orders on schedule. There's still the question of shipping capacity. So retailers are caught in a terrible position. Order too little inventory, and you have empty shelves in December, disappointed customers, and lost revenue. order too much, and you've overcommitted to products that might not sell if consumer confidence wavers. The margin for error is vanishingly small, and the margin of certainty is even smaller. Meanwhile, in farmland across the American Midwest, there's a different kind of clock running. Harvest is happening, or has recently happened. Equipment needs to be serviced. Loans need to be serviced. Land payments are coming due. The agricultural calendar doesn't pause for geopolitical uncertainty. It keeps moving, indifferent to frameworks and negotiations happening in Washington and Beijing. If Chinese soybean orders don't materialize until January, many farmers will have already absorbed months of financial pressure. Some will have made structural decisions, selling equipment, liquidating assets, taking on additional debt based on reasonable expectations that didn't pan out. By the time the orders come, those decisions are already embedded in their operations. This is the cruelty of economic leverage applied through timing. It doesn't always require that you completely refuse to follow through. Sometimes it's enough to follow through slowly after the other party has already incurred costs based on uncertainty about whether you would follow through at all. Part 11. The question that lingers. So we arrive at the question that Bessent is essentially asking, without quite saying it out loud. What is China actually planning? Not what are they saying they're planning? Not what does the framework nominally commit them to? But what do they actually intend to do? Are they genuinely resetting the relationship? Are they trying to reduce tensions and establish a more stable competitive relationship? Or is this framework just a pause? A breathing room before the next phase of pressure?